Nora Bennett had worked 11 years to get an office with a window. She stood in front of the glass now, on the 14th floor of Callahan Meridian Group, watching the sun hit the Chicago skyline like it was throwing her a private welcome party. Her name was already on the door. Nora Bennett, Senior Strategy Director. She'd read it 4 times since she walked in that morning, just to make sure it wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a mistake. It was the job she'd chased since she was 24 years old, broke, and answering phones at a call center that smelled like burnt coffee and desperation. First day nerves, asked Priya, the woman from HR who'd woke her up. She had a kind face and the tired eyes of someone who'd onboarded 100 people and buried none of the excitement she still felt doing it. Something like that, Nora said, laughing a little. Her hands were shaking, just slightly. She pressed them flat against her thighs so no one would notice. She had reason to be nervous. Nora hadn't just landed a job. She had clawed her way out of a company that fired her without warning 8 months earlier, Whitlock Media, a place she'd given 6 years of her life to, only to be handed a cardboard box and a 2-week severance check on a Tuesday afternoon like she was disposable. She still remembered the silence in the elevator going down. The way her own reflection in the chrome doors looked like a stranger. Callahan Meridian was supposed to be her redemption story. A bigger office. A better title. Proof that Whitlock had been wrong about her. At 9:47 a.m., an email arrived requesting she come to the 12th floor conference room to meet the new VP of Operations. Nora smoothed her blazer, checked her reflection in the elevator glass, and told herself this was just a formality. New leadership always wanted to meet the team. She'd done this dance before. She had not expected the woman sitting at the head of the table to be Diane Castellano. For a full 3 seconds. Nora's brain refused to process it. Diane looked older than she remembered, silver threading through her dark hair, sharper cheekbones, a stillness in her expression that hadn't been there before. But the eyes were the same. Nora would have recognized those eyes anywhere, because they were the last eyes she saw the day she got fired from Whitlock Media. Diane had been the CFO back then. She'd sat 2 seats down from Nora's old boss during the termination meeting and said nothing. Not one word in Nora's defense. Nora remembered that silence more than she remembered the firing itself. Nora, Diane said now, folding her hands on the table. Her voice was calm. Measured. The voice of someone who had rehearsed this moment. Please, sit down. Nora sat, her pulse thudding in her ears. I want to be direct with you, Diane continued, because I think you deserve directness, more than most people I've worked with. Nora's stomach dropped. She knew, somehow, before the words even came, what was happening. Effective today, your position here has been eliminated. The room tilted, just slightly. Nora heard herself say, I'm sorry, what? The strategy division is being restructured, Diane said. I made this decision last week, before you started. I should have told HR to freeze the onboarding, and that's on me. I'm sorry you came in today for this. You're firing me, Nora said, her voice flat with disbelief, on my first day. Yes. Nora felt heat rush up her neck, into her face. 11 years of climbing, and here she was again, sitting across a table from a Castellano, losing everything in under 60 seconds. Do you have any idea, Nora said, her voice shaking now, what it took me to get here? Do you have any idea what happened the last time I sat in a room like this? Diane's composure cracked, just barely. I know exactly what happened, she said quietly. I was there. Then why would you do this to me twice? Diane looked down at the folder in front of her. And for a moment, she didn't answer. When she looked back up, her eyes were wet. Because firing you today, she said, is the only way I know how to save your career. And before you walk out of this building hating me, I need you to let me explain something I've been carrying for 8 years. Nora's hand was already on the strap of her bag, ready to leave, ready to never look back at this glass tower again. But something in Diane's voice, something broken and urgent underneath the calm, made her stay in the chair. I've been watching you, Diane said, since the day I let them fire you. And what I saw was never what they told you it was. Nora stared at her, waiting for the punchline that would make this make sense. It didn't come. Watching me, she repeated. What does that even mean? Diane exhaled slowly, like she'd rehearsed this moment 100 times in her head and none of the versions had felt right. It means I've read every article with your byline. Every panel you spoke on. I was in the audience at the Midwest Marketing Summit 2 years ago when you gave that talk about brand trust after a crisis. I sat in the third row. You didn't see me. Nora's jaw tightened. You could have said something then. I know. You could have said something the day they walked me out of Whitlock with a box of pens and a stress ball. I know that too, Diane said, and her voice cracked on the word no, just slightly, like a plate with a hairline fracture. I've known it every day since. Nora shook her head, standing up now, chair scraping against the floor. I don't need an apology tour, Diane. I needed a job. I needed rent money. I needed to look my daughter in the eye and tell her things were going to be okay, and I did that on a lie, because I didn't have an answer. You have a daughter, Diane said softly. Not a question. A fact she already knew. Nora froze. How do you? Maya, Diane said. 11 years old. Loves horses. Wants to be a marine biologist. The room went silent except for the hum of the air vent overhead. Nora felt something cold slide down her spine. You've been investigating me, she said. I've been trying to help you, Diane said, in the only way I was allowed to. Allowed to. Nora's voice rose. Who tells a grown woman she's allowed to help someone? Diane's hands, folded on the table, tightened until her knuckles went pale. My husband did, she said. Richard Castellano. Chairman of the board at Whitlock Media. The man who fired you. The name landed like a slap. Nora had heard it 100 times in her old office, always in the tone people use for weather systems, forces you didn't argue with, only prepared for. You're married to him, Nora said slowly, piecing it together, feeling something ugly rise in her chest. You're married to the man who ended my career, and you sat in that meeting and said nothing, and now you're standing here acting like you're some kind of guardian angel. I'm not asking you to see me as a guardian angel, Diane said. I'm asking you to let me explain what actually happened that day, because you don't know the whole story, and neither did I, until 3 years after it happened. Nora crossed her arms. Every muscle in her body wanted to walk out the door, but there was a small, stubborn part of her, the same part that had gotten her through 11 years of climbing back from nothing, that needed to hear this. She sat back down, slowly, like the chair itself might not be safe. Talk, she said. Diane nodded, and for the first time since Nora had walked into the room, she looked less like a corporate executive and more like a woman carrying something heavy she'd never been allowed to put down. Richard didn't fire you because of your performance, Diane said. You know that already, I think. Your numbers were the best in the division. Everyone knew it. He fired you because you refused to falsify the client retention report for the Bramwell account. Nora's breath caught. She hadn't spoken about the Bramwell account in 8 years. She hadn't told anyone, not her sister, not her closest friend, not even Maya's father before he left, that the real reason she'd been pushed out wasn't restructuring, the word HR had used. It was because she'd said no to a man who didn't hear that word often. How do you know about that? Nora whispered. Because I found the email chain, Diane said. 3 years ago. After Richard and I separated, not divorced yet, but living apart, I was going through old server backups for an audit, and I found what he'd asked you to do. And I found your response. One line. I won't put my name on a lie, even if it cost me my job. Nora's eyes stung. She remembered typing those words at 11:40 at night, hands shaking, knowing exactly what it would cost her, and sending it anyway. You quoted my email back to me, Nora said, word for word. I've read it more times than I can count, Diane said. It's the reason I left him. Not the only reason. But the first crack. Nora opened her mouth to respond, and that was the moment the conference room door opened without a knock, and a man Nora hadn't seen in 8 years stepped inside, wearing a suit that cost more than her first car, his eyes locking instantly on his wife. Diane, Richard Castellano said, his voice low and controlled. What exactly do you think you're doing? Diane's spine straightened before she even turned around. Nora watched the shift happen in real time, the woman who'd just been trembling over an old email, replaced by someone colder, more guarded, someone bracing for impact. I'm having a private conversation, Richard, Diane said. This doesn't concern you. Everything at this company concerns me, he said, stepping fully into the room. His eyes moved to Nora, and something flickered there, recognition, then irritation, then something closer to alarm. Miss Bennett. I wasn't aware you were joining Callahan Meridian. I wasn't aware you owned Callahan Meridian, Nora said, her voice sharper than she meant it to be. Small world, apparently. I don't own it, Richard said. I sit on the board. As does my wife, as of 6 months ago. His jaw tightened as he looked at Diane. Which she failed to mention comes with certain conflict of interest. There's no conflict, Diane said. I hired her because she was the best candidate. That's not a conflict, Richard. That's called competence. You hired the one person in Chicago who could turn this into a lawsuit against Whitlock, Richard said, his voice low, urgent now. Do you understand what you've done? Nora felt the floor shift under her again. A lawsuit, she repeated. What lawsuit? Richard's eyes cut toward her, and for the first time, Nora saw something she never expected from him, hesitation. Tell her, Diane said quietly. Or I will. Richard was silent for a long moment. Then he pulled out a chair, sat down across from Nora like a man settling in for a negotiation he'd already lost, and folded his hands. The Bramwell account, he said. After you left, the numbers you refused to falsify came out anyway. Not because of anything you did. A junior analyst noticed the discrepancy 18 months later and reported it. The SEC opened an inquiry. It's still open. Nora's mouth went dry. And what does that have to do with me? Because your email, Richard said, the one where you refused, the one Diane found, it's the only documented proof inside the company that someone raised the red flag before the collapse. It's the difference between this being framed as fraud that leadership orchestrated, and fraud that leadership concealed after being warned. You're telling me, Nora said slowly, the anger rising in her chest like floodwater, that I've spent 8 years believing I lost my career over nothing, over some invisible mistake I must have made, when the truth is I was the only person who did the right thing. And you buried it. I didn't bury anything, Richard said. I fired you to make the problem disappear. I never expected it to resurface. That's not an apology, Nora snapped. That's a confession. The room went silent. Diane's eyes were on her husband, unreadable, waiting. So why hire me now? Nora said, turning back to Diane, her voice raw. If this is about a lawsuit, if this is about protecting the company, then everything you said about watching my career, believing in me, was that real, or was I just a name on a legal strategy document? Diane flinched like she'd been slapped. It's both, she said. It has always been both. I've admired you since before I knew any of this mattered legally. But yes, when I saw your resume come across my desk for this position, I knew hiring you would also protect you if this ever became public. I thought I was doing something good for both of us. Then why fire me an hour after I started? Diane's throat moved as she swallowed. Because this morning, she said, I found out Richard already knows you're here. And I found out he's been in contact with someone at the SEC this week. If you're on payroll when this becomes public, it will look like Callahan Meridian is buying your silence. I had to remove you from the org chart before anyone could accuse you of being compromised. Nora sat back, stunned, the anger draining out of her and leaving something colder and more frightening in its place. You fired me, she said slowly, to protect me from a fight I didn't even know was happening. Yes, Diane said. Richard's phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at it, and whatever color remained in his face disappeared entirely. They've moved up the deposition, he said quietly, almost to himself. They want to talk to Nora Bennett by name. Tomorrow morning. Diane closed her eyes. Nora felt her whole understanding of the last 8 years crack open like ice on a lake, and underneath it, something she hadn't expected at all, the shape of a truth that was about to become very public, very fast, and completely out of her control. Nora barely remembered leaving the building. She remembered the elevator, the cold rush of November air on Michigan Avenue, and the sound of her own heartbeat drowning out the traffic. Somewhere in the blur, she'd called her sister, Camille, and said the words, "I need you to pick up Maya today," and somewhere after that, she'd ended up back in her small apartment in Logan Square, sitting at her kitchen table with a stone-cold cup of coffee she never drank. Her phone buzzed. A text from Diane. "Please don't go anywhere tomorrow morning without talking to me first. I can protect you. But only if you let me." Nora stared at the message for a long time before setting the phone face down. That night, Maya sat across from her at the table, swinging her legs, oblivious to the storm cracking open around them. "Did you like your new job?" she asked, mouth full of spaghetti. Nora forced a smile. "It was complicated, Bug. Complicated like math, or complicated like when Aunt Camille and Grandma don't talk for a week." Nora laughed despite herself, and for a moment the tightness in her chest loosened. "The second one," she said. Maya considered this with the seriousness only an 11-year-old could summon. "Well, Grandma always says the truth is like a splinter. It hurts more the longer you leave it in." Nora looked at her daughter, dark curls, her father's stubborn chin, none of his cowardice, and felt her eyes burn. "Your grandma's smarter than all of us," she whispered. She didn't sleep that night. She sat at the table long after Maya went to bed, turning the last 8 years over in her mind like a stone she'd carried so long she'd forgotten its shape. She thought about the meeting where they told her the position was no longer necessary. She thought about the recruiter at her next 3 interviews who'd looked at her resume, looked at the gap where Whitlock used to be, and asked polite, careful questions that were really just "What did you do wrong?" She thought about crying in a parking garage the day her unemployment ran out, and the sick, hollow feeling of telling Maya they'd have to move to a smaller apartment. All of it, every ounce of shame she'd swallowed, had been because she told the truth to a man who couldn't stand hearing it. By 6 a.m., she'd made a decision. She called Diane. "I'll go to the deposition," Nora said, before Diane could speak. "But not to protect Callahan Meridian. Not to protect you. And not to protect Richard, God knows. I'm going because I'm done being erased from my own story." There was a long pause on the line. "I wouldn't expect anything less," Diane said quietly. "I have our legal team meet you there. You won't go in alone." "One more thing," Nora said. "I want my job back. Not as a favor. Not as compensation. If I'm good enough to protect this company's legal position, I'm good enough to help build its strategy. You either believe that or you don't." "I believe it," Diane said, without hesitation. "I believed it before any of this happened." The deposition room, when Nora walked into it the next morning, was colder than she expected, pale walls, fluorescent light, a court reporter setting up equipment with the practice calm of someone who had seen 100 careers unravel in this exact chair. Richard Castellano sat across the table, his lawyer beside him, his face unreadable. Diane sat 2 seats down, close enough that Nora could feel the warmth of her presence like a hand at her back. Though neither of them said a word. The SEC attorney, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia Illich, opened a folder and slid a printed email across the table. Nora recognized it immediately, the words she'd typed 8 years ago at 11:40 p.m., trembling and furious and certain. "Miss Bennett," Patricia said. "Did you write this email?" "I did," Nora said, her voice steady for the first time in 2 days. "And can you tell us what happened after you sent it?" Nora looked at Richard. He didn't look away. "I was fired 11 days later," Nora said. "I was told it was a restructuring. I now understand that wasn't true." Richard's lawyer leaned in and whispered something urgent. Richard's jaw worked, but he said nothing. "One more question," Patricia said, "and I want you to think carefully before you answer, Miss Bennett. Were you ever offered any compensation, any severance, any agreement in exchange for your silence about the Bramwell numbers?" The room went still. Nora felt every eye on her, felt 8 years of swallowed shame rising in her throat like a held breath finally released. "No," she said clearly. "Nobody ever thought I was worth the price of buying my silence. They just assumed I'd disappear quietly. And for 8 years, I did." She looked at Diane. "Not anymore," she said. The deposition lasted 3 hours. When it ended, Richard Castellano didn't look at Nora again. He gathered his folder with hands that weren't quite steady and walked out flanked by his lawyer, and something about his silence, the absence of any last attempt to charm or intimidate, told Nora more than any confession could have. Diane walked her out to the parking garage afterward. Neither of them spoke for a long moment, standing beside Nora's car in the grey November light. "The board will meet Thursday," Diane finally said. Richard stepping down as chairman. "He doesn't have a choice anymore, the SEC filing alone will force it, and honestly, I think some part of him is relieved. He's been carrying this for years too, just differently than I have." Nora nodded slowly. "And you?" "I'm staying," Diane said. "Someone has to clean up what he built without pretending it wasn't broken." She hesitated, and for the first time since Nora had met her, she looked unsure of her footing. "I meant what I said about your job, Nora. It's yours if you want it. Not out of guilt. Because you're the best strategist I've read about in a decade, and I don't care what disaster brought you back into my life. I'm not letting you walk away from this building twice." Nora looked up at the glass tower, the same one she'd stood inside 3 days ago, believing her life was finally turning a corner. In a strange way, she realized, it had, just not the corner she expected. "I have conditions," Nora said. Diane almost smiled. "Of course you do. I want it in writing. Real severance protections, real whistleblower protections, and I want a seat at the table when this company writes its new ethics policy. Not as a symbol. As someone with actual say." "Done," Diane said, without blinking. "And Diane." Nora's voice softened, just slightly. "I need you to understand something. I don't forgive easily. I'm not going to pretend the last 8 years didn't happen just because you found an old email and felt guilty. I'm coming back because I earned this job twice, and I'm not giving it up again for anyone's comfort. Yours included. I wouldn't want it any other way," Diane said. "For what it's worth, watching your career from a distance for 8 years wasn't guilt, Nora. It was respect. I just didn't know how to turn respect into anything useful until now." That evening, Nora picked Maya up from Camille's house, and for the first time in days, she felt something like peace settle over her, quiet and unfamiliar. Maya chattered the whole ride home about a science project on tide pools, and Nora listened, really listened, the way she hadn't been able to all week. "You look different, Mom," Maya said, studying her at a red light. "Happier different. What happened?" Nora thought about the splinter her mother used to talk about, the truth that hurts more the longer you leave it buried. She thought about 11 days between an email and a firing, and 8 years between that firing and this one strange, complicated redemption. "I got my splinter out," Nora said. Maya frowned, confused, and Nora just laughed, really laughed, for the first time in longer than she could remember, and reached over to squeeze her daughter's hand at the red light, the city lights glowing gold against the windshield, the weight of 8 years finally lifting off her chest. 3 months later, Nora Bennett walked into her office on the 14th floor for the second time. Her name was already on the door. This time, nobody was waiting to take it away.